Hello and welcome to another conversation about conversations. My name is Ivan Farber. I'm the host. Today, I am joined by my friend, colleague, and mentor, Dr. Lorraine Haataia. Welcome, Dr. Lorraine.
Thank you, Ivan. I'm thrilled to be here.
We have an affiliation with each other because I'm a member of an organization that you created called ProlificWriters.Life. And your mission is to support writers, and my mission is to get support from you. So this conversation today about conversations is actually in support of my mission to spread my book far and wide. So I'm giving the listeners of my podcast the opportunity to kind of listen into an advice session.
Fantastic.
You want to talk about Prolific Writers Life at the start here?
Prolific Writers Life came about because I have been a writer ever since the time I can remember, saying, what do you want to do when you grow up? When people were asked that question, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I want to be a writer was always what came out. But the interesting thing is, Ivan, our country is so set up for traditional education, go to school, go to college and go do your thing. But becoming a writer is not such a clear-cut path, especially a published author. But interestingly enough, I did follow the traditional plan. I went to college, was an English major and French, and basically kept going to college. All of my instructors, when I said, what do I need to do to become a published author? They all said what a professor would say, which is keep going to college. If you have a PhD after your name, you're going to be able to publish. But the thing is, it almost became the opposite because our educational system teaches us to follow all the rules. I did get out and I did become a professor. I taught English. I taught English as a second language. And then I got into corporate training. I did a lot of marketing, copy, and did stuff for intranets, company intranet services for information, and then into quality control. So writing was really core to my career, but it never was the creative writing that I was deeper inside that I really wanted to do. I just felt like there just wasn't an easy place for writers to go to, this kind of place where they can meet other people, other authors and writers and writing industry experts to get what they need on a regular basis. Of course, there are conferences and I went to those, but you end up with a lot of random conversations instead of continued conversations and building relationships.
Getting the word conversations in there perfectly. What is your PhD in?
My doctorate's actually in curriculum and instruction.
And use the word creative. What kind of writing do you consider creative, or what did you specifically mean?
Oh, that's interesting. I guess by definition, any kind of writing could feel or be defined as creative. But when you're writing standard operating procedures for a company, for example, as I did for quality control, the whole point of it is clarity. Explain to people step one, step two. You can't really be super creative with that. In fact, the more concise you are, the better, so that then people will actually read it. But I guess with creative writing, for me, it had more to do with self-exploration, exploring the world, exploring spirituality, connecting with other writers, finding out what they want to do with their books. And, truthfully, Ivan, your book, you are in my genre that I read. I read self-help books. I have ever since I can remember. Inspirational books. I think your book falls into both of those categories. Business books, it falls into that category. These are the kinds of things that I've always been drawn to. I wrote this in the review that I wrote for your book. You're right up there with Napoleon Hill and the best of the best. It's your book, the Zig Ziglar, these classics that are going to stand the test of time.
I love your feedback and your vision, and we all need people to believe in us. So I'm delighted. What I want to know from you, because you have this big vision for me and where my book belongs, is how do I get there? I could have a great book, but it could just sit in a few people's houses, or I could have a book that goes on the shelf with Covey and Ziglar and Brian Tracy, and those are all like role models of mine. So how do I do it? I know that's an easy question.
What's interesting, Ivan, and I say this to so many writers that either they already are an author or they want to be an author, is what most writers don't realize is that each time they write a book, they're starting a mini business. You're right. I mean, you can have a little popsicle shop set up on a corner in a neighborhood and you're crossing your fingers that a lot of people drive by and want popsicles. You hope it's a hot day, you know, and it's and people stop and then actually ask questions and say, hey, you know, how can I get these to my friends? It's a business. I mean, and most writers don't think of it like that. They think, in fact, most writers aren't even particularly interested in sales or marketing. Probably the average person who published, the average writer who puts a book up on Kindle, they're thinking about the marketing after the fact, after the book is there. And a lot of people who are into marketing and the publicists and so forth will tell you, you need to be thinking about that from the day you start writing your book. Let's just assume that most writers don't do that. And now the book is out there. You happen to be in a good position because you have a phenomenal book. A lot of people put books out there and they're not thinking about the audience, but you have such great content because, you know, I printed out the 10 lessons here. These 10 lessons are obviously lessons that you've been learning over your career for decades, probably.
And being in financial services and being a relationship manager, all I have, I mean, there's brochures and websites, but all I really have in terms of value to bring to my clients is a conversation. And so I set about trying to have the best conversations I could have, the most effective, that would help people self-actualize, help them feel good about the relationship with me and my company. And there's objective things that you can do in a conversation that work. And there's things that all of us do that consistently don't work. And so I went down the path of learning, what was I doing that wasn't working? And by the way, I still learn what I'm doing that doesn't work pretty much every day. But then I've been able to build a foundation upon things that do work.
You know, I think it's interesting when your work is in the financial industry, and I think people have a great need for conversation around the topic of money because there's a lot of fears, a lot of baggage that comes. There are assumptions, expectations that may or may not be realistic. The take on that with the financial industry is just so interesting. And you know, these 10 lessons that you came up with are so foundational, not just for the financial industry. These 10 lessons are so applicable to any conversation anywhere. You know, when you invited me to come to this conversation, the thing that I wanted to pick up on was, well, what did I find so helpful? And lesson 2, use questions skillfully. When I read through this chapter, I realized that I had a tendency to ask very directed questions. Whereas in many cases, it might be much more effective to ask a very open-ended question. And I catch myself now, and it's been fantastic to have the examples in your book are very specific and kind of tell you, if you do this, this is the result you're going to get with your question. But if you do this, wow, look what could happen. I found that to be so powerful. The prepare and plan. How often do we come to conversations with no plan other than I have this meeting set up? I mean, I'll be the first one to say I need to keep working on all of these, and I'm waiting to find out what you're going to do so that people like me can say, let's go review chapter 6, you know, let's have a roundtable discussion with people. Let's review what was in that chapter, practice some of the conversation. But prepare and plan. And one of the things I try to do in my business is to block out 30 minutes before I actually have a meeting so that I'm preparing. It doesn't always happen because life happens, interruptions happen, an urgent email, whatever. But planning for conversations, wow, that's very rare. And it's such a treasure, such a piece of wisdom. And the last one is resolve. So we have a meeting or we have a discussion, and then we all leave with expectations thinking, oh, I know what he meant. I know what she meant. And then we all come back next time and say, I thought you meant. So without that clarity and resolve of what's next and who's on first and who's on second. And those are the 3 chapters that really stood out for me through my first study of the book.
I like how you say first study, because it is an ongoing study. And I go through the 10 chapters myself, and I think about them before conversations. I think about after, like I have on my monitor a list of the 10 lessons. And so when I go into a conversation, I kind of think, okay, I need to build rapport. I got to think about what questions you can kind of tie preparing with questions. Like people often come prepared with topics instead of coming prepared with questions. But remembering like, what's my listening plan? How am I going to satisfy needs? So that's the rules, right? Rapport, use questions skillfully, listen, exercise self-control, and satisfy needs. So that's the rules. The clear part is the create, learn, explore, address, and resolve. And so I do have kind of an idea for a second book called Clear Rules for Conversations.
Ooh.
Like if you picture like one of those big like rule books, and it says Clear Rules for Conversations. I'm glad to know that the chapters that are with you right now, but it really is true. All of them are foundational, and you could spend a week, a month, a year just on any one of them, and you'd never reach the height of your effectiveness. Like you could keep getting better at rapport. You could keep getting better at exploring and addressing. You can always get better.
One of the things that I think about with your book, Ivan, I think you're probably familiar with Toastmasters as an organization, and we're both probably Toastmasters, but you know, Toastmasters has this pattern for practicing speaking opportunities. And when you told me about Conversations University or having some sort of study for this book and beyond, I'm so fascinated with it because it's so deserving of it. What gift can we give a person that's greater than true listening, truly understanding, truly taking the time to figure out where they are? I don't even know if the word love is in this book, but this is a very loving thing to do, to give your full attention to other people. And so few people do it. I mean, how often do we see people that are, you know, we're with friends and literally, you know, whether we're at a cafe or at the dinner table at home, wherever we are, and attention is not even on the people. And this is needed more than ever right now.
So yes, my book could be a study book. As you were talking, I thought, you know, you have the Competent Toastmasters Manual, which is 10 speeches. You could have 10 conversations that you focus on.
Most book clubs focus on fiction. I think there's a real need for more nonfiction book clubs. And I know they're out there, and there are some companies that require their employees to read a book or two or three a year, or maybe it's typically because there's a leader in the organization that understands the power of books. You know, if there's any kind of treasure hunt you and I could go on together for your book, it would be, how do we find those people who really value the books that can change their people and that then changes the organization? Even for Prolific Writers Life, I know the importance. I know how powerful your book can be on any organization. Writers need to have good conversations, but it never ends. Everybody needs to have good conversations if they want to have good results and good relationships. I do think that you are a professional. You come across very professional. And so taking that approach to being a keynote speaker for bigger companies for your book, I think is a fantastic pathway for you. What else? TEDx talks, TED Talk, if you could do that, that's always, you know, good exposure. But, you know, I think, so there's two sides of this. There's the big exposure through the TED Talks and the keynote speeches and that kind of thing. But I think there's also a need for the grassroots level, where literally just roundtable, maybe it's a Zoom call with 10 or 12 people. And this week we're going to talk about lesson 1. And people are going to tell stories about what they tried, what worked, and then what they're going to do next week for lesson 2. Or I don't know what the structure is, but I think if you play around with different structures, that you could get something going where you wouldn't always have to be the leader, that these groups could go with or without you. We are all relationship managers. I mean, if we go survey 1,000 people right now, you do it where you are and I do it where I am, and I ask 1,000 people, what do you do? Not one person is going to say that. When in effect, that's It is something, it's so universal. It's something we all do. But the other thing too, Ivan, is sometimes the things that are most obvious, the greatest needs in life, the life skills, even financial skills, they're not really taught to kids.
I am a big fan of people opting themselves into this conversation. Speaking of conversations about conversations and opting in, I want to thank you for opting yourself into this conversation. And I want to thank all my listeners out there for being a part of this conversation. I love to hear from listeners. So if you're listening to this right now, feel free to message me either privately or publicly on the social media platforms that you find this episode and this podcast. But again, Lorraine, thank you for being a part of this conversation about conversations.
Thank you, Ivan. It's a pleasure. I love that you take it so seriously, like the analytical, you're dealing with conversations on two levels. So you're in the conversation, but you're also observing the conversation. And I know that you've trained yourself to pay attention to that, but it's really fantastic.
Yes, I actually can envision, I am actually in a conversation in 3 different ways, or maybe sometimes 4 different ways. Like I'm thinking about what's my experience, what's your experience, and then what would be the experience of a person watching what we're doing.
Mhm.
And I'm producing a podcast at the same time.